Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining the EDA CARES Act grant funding webinar. I'm Andrea Tantillo from the Houston-Galveston Area Council, and before we get started, I want to let you know that the meeting is being recorded and remind you that all participant microphones will be muted throughout the presentations. We'll have some time for questions at the end. You'll just type your questions in the question box. Now I'd like to introduce H-GAC Executive Director Chuck Whipple to give us a brief introduction.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad that you're able to join us for our virtual meeting today, our webinar on the Economic Development Administration CARES Act funding that could be coming to our region if we all pull together and put together some great grant applications. I'm Chuck Whipple. I lead the Houston-Galveston Area Council of Governments. I actually got my start at H-GAC in the Economic Development Program, working with EDA and other partners on economic development initiatives across our 13-county region. It's important to understand that the Economic Development Administration funding is always the fastest recovery funding that quickly moves from the federal level to local governments to help with recovery needs. We've had a fantastic relationship with EDA over the years. We'll hear from Josh Owens in a little bit, who currently heads our economic development efforts at H-GAC. And since Hurricane Ike, we've worked together to bring over $80 million in grant funding from the Economic Development Administration to the H-GAC region to help our communities recover after natural disasters and now the current economic downturn and situation we have with COVID-19. This current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic downturn has brought disruption like we have not seen before. It brings unprecedented challenges and opportunities to our region. And I want you to know that the Houston-Galveston Area Council and our Gulf Coast Economic Development District stand ready to serve you and to help you have your communities recover in a sustainable way. I'm going to turn the presentation over to one of our guest speakers, Mr. Jeffrey Sjostrom. Jeff and I have had the opportunity to work together for over 15 years. Jeff leads our the Galveston Economic Development Partnership on Galveston Island. He is a local, regional, and national economic recovery leader. He has partnered with H-GAC. He's partnered with the state. He's been on a series of task force initiatives to look at speeding up recovery efforts after economic downturns at the state and the federal level. And he's consistently called upon to be parts of presentations like this, both within the H-GAC region and nationally through the International Economic Development Council. And with that, I hope you have a fantastic webinar. We have two more great speakers after Jeff. They all start with the letter J. We have Josh Owens and Jason Wilson, and you'll hear from them later on today as well. I hope you have a fantastic webinar. And with that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Chuck, thank you so much. And while you're on the call, you have been a tremendous resource and ally for this region, and in particular for Galveston. And it is great, all of the service that you've provided, and we're greatly appreciative to that, not only for what you've done, but for what you're going to continue to do for us into the future. It is a pleasure to be on this webinar today, and I've been asked just to share some of our experiences. Chuck talked about roughly $80 million of Economic Development Administration grants brought into this region since Hurricane Ike. Galveston has been the recipient of approximately 25 million of that in projects in Galveston, and I think today I'd just like to share some of our experiences and some of the lessons that we've learned. I am the president of the Galveston Economic Development Partnership. We are a private 501c6 membership-based organization. Our mission is really pretty simple: working to expand Galveston's employment and tax bases. We have been engaged since Hurricane Katrina in disaster planning, disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Have a long history of working with local, regional, national entities and looking at strategies and trying to improve our processes here on the island. As we're in the heels of this pandemic with COVID-19 and simultaneously now in hurricane season, with already 3 storms named in this season, very early into the season. Disaster preparedness is something that's in our lifeline, something that we talk about on an annual basis and a routine basis. The next slide, Andrea, is just meant to kind of share. We've got a response strategy that we deploy in times of catastrophic events. And like all of you, we've been actively engaged over these last few months in trying to deal with the pandemic. We have a host of partners and allies that have a myriad of recovery resources, tools, programs, links, things that are available. And so I've provided those here just as a sampling of the types of organizations that we work with. The Economic Development Administration is a strategic partner to the Galveston Economic Development Partnership and to our community. Andrea, the next slide will just give you an idea. There's a Freudian slip by Chuck when he started to introduce me, because I actually worked at the Houston-Galveston Area Council for 8 years prior to coming to Galveston. And H-GAC upped their game and improved the intellectual capacity of their folks when they hired Chuck after I left to take over the Economic Development District and the economic development activities. But EDA has been for, I guess I have a 30-year relationship with the Austin Regional Office through a host of projects. And I wanted to just hit on a couple of these projects for your review. First, and Josh will talk more in depth about the Gulf Coast Economic Development District. This is really our cornerstone group. This is the group that organizes and maintains the SEDS process, the strategies that allow us to maintain eligibility for funding. And in addition to just that, they continue to provide a wealth of resources to us on an ongoing basis. Really, the first project that we did in Galveston centered around the renovations of a historic structure, a historic mansion. And this was turned into a telemedicine high-tech center for the University of Texas Medical Branch. This was done back in the early, I guess, mid-90s, and was a collaboration with UTMB in converting this facility that even now more so today, we have been the beneficiary of telemedicine and the technologies that follow as it relates to dealing with this pandemic and the ability to connect not only remote locations, but rural centers and rural hospitals and employers across the country. After, I guess there's two players that we work with extremely strongly, EDA obviously, and then the International Economic Development Council. Jeff Finkel, who runs that organization, has been a long-time supporter, a vocal advocate for EDA and all that they do. One of the things that we benefited by from EDA funding was after both Hurricane Ike and then the Horizon oil spill that happened in 2010, just 2 years after Hurricane Ike. The International Economic Development Council brought planning teams to Galveston and allowed us to gather our leadership and to formulate plans and strategies on how to respond and recover from those events. And even though we had a dearth of plans that were cultivated after these catastrophic events, the ones that came from IEDC, the ones that were supported by EDA, helped us specifically move forward with our economic development strategies to build back better, stronger, faster. And we remain grateful for those efforts. Obviously, Hurricane Ike was the one that really hit Galveston hard, and we were able to work with UTMB on two strategic projects that really represent cornerstones in our economic base. One was renovating and reestablishing the Customs House. The UTMB Customs House was the emerging technology incubator prior to Hurricane Ike. But for EDA funding, I'm fairly convinced that this facility would have never been or still be waiting for renovations to occur. And through this funding, we're able to stand proudly with the fact that we've got over 20 emerging technology companies now on the island. We've got another 8 to 10 that are in development that are presenting on a regular basis. And now specifically after COVID, we've got pages of innovations and new developments that are coming out of UTMB that this facility through the Customs House will provide the basis and the real kind of meeting place for these companies to be able to come together and collaborate and continue to grow their companies forward. Also, UTMB was instrumental in helping the Port of Galveston that as a non-tax paying port, the only port in Texas that doesn't have a tax base, the funding that came into the Port of Galveston provided critical funding to help get the port reopened and moving forward with cargoes and frozen product and other commodities that, again, Economic Development Administration was a true ally in helping propel the port forward. Also, in tandem with that, we also received through H-GAC, through EDA, the creation and the deployment of the Regional Revolving Loan Fund. And Josh, I'll let you talk about that if you want to, but that was another project that was funded through EDA funding and vision. We were the recipients of a capacity planning grant. I can't emphasize this enough. One of the real challenges as a nonprofit, especially now in post-COVID as a 501c6, is the ability for membership organizations, whether you're economic development or chamber of commerces. We have not been allowed to be a part of the COVID, the CARES Act response in any of the PPP funding opportunities. And EDA came through for us after Hurricane Ike and the Horizon oil spill and actually provided us with some planning funding to help us continue to implement and deploy resources to our business community to keep it moving forward. And then fast forward after Hurricane Harvey, we did a lot of outreach after the storm just up and down the Texas coast, working with our allies to provide lessons learned and support to them. But then I also had the opportunity to participate as a volunteer and went to the Pensacola Destin area for areas that were impacted by storms there, and was able to work, and that has built new relationships that we will probably maintain forever as we go forward. And again, it's just another example of how EDA funding gets to the streets and helps us move forward. Andrea, last slide. I thought about this as we were talking, and in terms of moving forward with EDA, we'll have some Q&A, but I just wanted to hit on a couple of key points from my vantage point as a layman and somebody who's worked with EDA. Some lessons that we've learned and some ideas. One, work with the resources that are available that are out there for you. Whether it be working with, you're going to hear Economic Development Representative Jason Wilson, but I got to tell you, all of the staff of EDA is tremendous, and they're there to work with you and to help you. And one of the things I really enjoy about EDA is they are probably the straightest shooting agency that I've ever worked with, in terms of whether or not your idea has the plausibility of being funded, or if it's not something that will fit within there. What I really enjoy and appreciate is the fact that they'll work with you if you have a viable project to help make that project something that is worthy of EDA consideration for funding. Obviously, Josh with the Gulf Coast Economic Development District, and then online through eda.gov. I think it's really critical. The more that you can educate yourself, everybody's willing to help walk you through the forms and the documents, but these documents and forms are available to you for the asking. I always say venture versus adventure. EDA is looking for ventures. And so they're looking for real projects. They're looking for things that where you have local match, where it's focusing predominantly on infrastructure type projects where they're ready to go, and something where it's not going to take a lot of manipulating. They'd like to see those projects come in and be able to provide their strategic resources, but not have to kind of create it on the fly. Leveraging resources and partners, that really goes to working with other local stakeholders. In Galveston, that ranges from the city to the port to UTMB to Texas A&M, other folks, and really trying to figure out how we can take it to the best, the highest and best value and the resources that we can identify. And then finally, just the fact that EDA Regional Office is your biggest ally. The thing that I say nationally, repeatedly, EDA is singularly the most responsive, most effective economic development organization for community in times of natural disasters and catastrophic events. We greatly appreciate all of our agencies. We've been very impressed with what SBA has done during this pandemic, but I got to tell you that EDA will work with you kind of cradle to grave, and are willing to look at your projects, willing to help you with regard to eligibility and structuring, and helping you to create the most competitive projects. So we just can't speak highly enough about the relationship we've had with the Economic Development Administration. And again, thank you all for letting me be a part of this webinar today. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Sjostrom, for sharing some information about projects and in Galveston and giving us some tips for working with the EDA and reminding us that the EDA is a good partner with the community. Next up, we have Jason Wilson from the EDA, which is a really good transition. And today he's going to discuss the CARES Act funding and EDA's criteria for making investments. Mr. Wilson.
Hello. Hello. Thank you. And just checking before I take off, is my screen appearing?
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, first, I would just like to acknowledge Chuck and his opening comments as Executive Director of Houston-Galveston Area Council. We heavily rely on his leadership in the region, and it's appreciated that the leadership attends and joins and contributes to key webinars like this so that we can help communities recover and be more resilient in the future. And Jeff, boy, that's quite a expert level detailed overview of EDA. I almost want to defer my time back to you. But nonetheless, I do have some CARES Act detailed information, so I'll drill down a little bit more, and I sure hope I can be helpful for today's audience. Let's see here, go to the next slide. Here's a brief agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about my team back in Austin, our partnership with the districts, of course, the NOFO for CARES Act funding, eligibility, and investment priorities, which is, in other words, developing competitive applications for this project. First is a map of the United States, of course, in EDA's 5-state region comprised of New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and of course, Texas. What's really great about this 5-state region and that the Austin Regional Office is especially proud of is that we have 100% coverage by way of our economic development districts, experts there to work with you all, including Chuck Wemple and of course Josh Owens, who will speak to us a little bit later. And I'll also talk about my role working with him in developing projects in the region. I report to my regional director, George Ayala, back in Austin, and area director, Matt Giannini. And we have a team there, including legal counsel, civil engineers, and project officers. And we work together in the spirit of helping applications become as complete and competitive as possible so that the communities most in need can have projects selected that will make the biggest impact. The most recent appropriation we received from Congress was quite an extraordinary amount, $1.5 billion, which from my understanding is among, if not the largest amount of disaster supplemental funding made available to the U.S. Economic Development Administration. I thought it would be interesting perspective to break that out across our 6 regional offices, including headquarters, so that you can get a sense of how this funding is made available throughout the country. One thing especially unique about this funding opportunity is that every county and every parish in Louisiana across the entire United States is eligible for this funding. So while this is a tremendous amount of funding available, our charge is to geographically disperse this as well as we can throughout the entire impacted area as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the challenge will be doing the best of our ability with this $236 million that we received in Austin to help communities most in need. The next slide, just further breaking down how these funds are going out. Initially, Chuck had mentioned that we are one of the agencies that get funding out quickly. And we did that by way of number 2 here, non-competitive awards, which were supplementally awarded to our existing economic development districts, being Houston-Galveston Area Council, tribes as applicable, high-performing revolving loan funds, and university centers. Headquarters will also have national competitions. Some of you might be aware of the Build to Scale competition that was recently closed. There'll be other competitions in the future, which may or may not include a connection and response and recovery with regard to the pandemic. But number 3 here is really the key thing that I want to focus in on, and certainly is really mostly directly connected to my role and working with you all out there, which is developing competitive applications that must all be awarded before September 30th, 2022. We'll be reviewing applications on a rolling basis beginning July and thereafter monthly. So there is no deadline for this competitive funding opportunity. However, it is expected that all of this funding will be gone in the next 2 years approximately. The application packages are available now. If you go to grants.gov, you can search PWEAA 2020 and you will find the grant opportunities application packages. Broadly speaking, we can support construction projects and non-construction projects. And I'll go into a little more detail later about what those examples would be. The cost share for communities that are eligible are generally expected to be 80% cost share, 80% for EDA, and 20% local. There may be few occasions in which 100% is considered in terms of the EDA share, but for those cases, it would have to be documented and supported with justification indicating that lending capacity of the applicant, or I'm sorry, borrowing capacity of the applicant was exhausted, and that there was undue financial stress, and there was just no reasonable way possible to come up with the local share required. But again, overwhelmingly, the cost share will be an 80-20 cost share for these projects. To be eligible for the grant funding opportunity, the proposed projects must demonstrate that they will prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, or respond to economic injury as a result of coronavirus. In past disaster supplemental funding opportunities, this has been referred to as a disaster nexus, but in this case, what we're essentially doing is talking about the negative detrimental impacts of the pandemic and how the proposed scope of work that the EDA could select would be a catalyst for economic recovery and resilience. This narrative is expected to be told within the general application forms, and we can work through that on a case-by-case process. Certainly, the more localized and more detailed this information is, will improve the competitiveness of applications. As most of you are likely well aware, our applicants include tribes, city and township governments, nonprofits, institutions of higher education, and the rest of the list there speaks for itself. But critically, what's expected out of EDA projects is that the private sector is benefited. There is primary job creation, job retention, perhaps economic resiliency is achieved by way of diversifying an economy through entrepreneurship, or perhaps increased capacity for recovery and resilience and economic activity in a region. So the beneficiaries of proposed projects is a critical element to consider. The next slide gets to one level beyond the nexus of establishing eligibility of CARES Act funding, which is our investment priorities. Most critically is the recovery and resilience investment priority. This is listed on our website, and it is absolutely necessary that this recovery and resilience investment priority be addressed in some way during the application narrative of its proposed scope of work. However, you will notice that there are 4 other investment priorities listed, and as applicable, you can stack up these investment priorities within the grant application narrative to communicate a critical infrastructure project, perhaps workforce development, manufacturing, exports and FDI, and even opportunity zones are also relevant to the project you're developing. The more elements that are aligned with EDA investment priorities, the potential for a competitive application is increased. Examples of projects, not by name and amount, but really just type and the category that they are received are, broadly speaking, again, 2 general categories, construction and non-construction. The first 2 items I want to talk about are planning and strategy projects that directly address distress caused by the pandemic and support economic recovery activities, improve resilience for future pandemics. Another good example could be, for example, Jeff had mentioned our partner is at International Economic Development Council. They are a nonprofit who has expertise in providing technical assistance for private sector entities, improving business continuity, recovery, and response in the context of a pandemic. Oftentimes, locally and regionally, there are high-performing, high-profile nonprofit organizations that are well-positioned to provide this sort of technical assistance. And so these are 2 good examples of common non-construction projects that are often supported by EDA funding and disaster supplemental funding opportunities. The next two examples are, generally speaking, the construction in nature, and they are the straightforward infrastructure projects, broadband, roads, water, sewer, etc. And the key again are the beneficiaries. In some way, will they support healthcare systems? Healthcare systems is critical in that, again, I know historically there have been hurricanes such as Ike, Gustav, Harvey, and it would be tempting to talk about the recovery and resilience of projects in that context. But above all else, the story we have to be telling and the proposed project must address the pandemic. So healthcare systems is perhaps more heavily weighted than it might have been historically, and would be critical to include in your project if it's applicable. Other projects could be, for example, a construction or facility improvement that might support an existing workforce development program for high-skilled, high-trade jobs that are in demand. Critical for these sorts of projects are statements from employers that are ready to hire individuals matriculating through the program. Here is a quick line here. I've not always included this in presentations, but recently I have received a few phone calls following up with me about asking for what might be fraudulent activity. So I just thought it would be appropriate to share this with you all to let you know that I'm available as needed to provide assistance on completing applications. I see my role in a very basic way, which is to provide assistance to make sure an application is complete and to make recommendations to ensure that it is competitive. As I transition to the next phase of our presentation, it's a great opportunity for me to talk about what I would say could be a best practice, and now I work with Josh Owens, our next presenter. EDA prides itself in supporting regionally and locally driven solutions to issues that matter most to communities. And we do not feel that we know best what those projects are, and so we really make every effort we can to work with local leadership, individuals like Josh, to develop projects. And we are both here available as resources to collaborate and communicate with you and to identify, is your proposed project feasible? Can it be a good chance of being selective through an extremely competitive process? And I really think of myself as a team, and certainly the Austin Regional Office thinks of the Houston-Galveston Area Council as a critical partner in the region for this response and recovery effort. So that those is my portion, and with that, I will leave it open for Josh in his segment of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and launch into my presentation, and I'm going to go probably quicker than my friends over at Toastmasters would recommend that I go. So just stay with me as we go through this presentation. I also wanted to mention that the IEDC currently, that Jeffrey and Jason both mentioned, currently has technical assistance available. So if you're looking, if you need some outside technical assistance developing a plan or a project, please be sure to contact me after this, and we can work to get you a volunteer who can either come to your community or work remotely. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that the Gulf Coast Economic Development District is funded by both the Economic Development Administration and the Houston-Galveston Area Council, and is staffed by Houston-Galveston Area Council employees, but is a standalone 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the economic development of the 13-county Gulf Coast Economic Development region. One of our primary outputs is our comprehensive economic development strategy that we developed that analyzes our economy and sets forth a strategic action plan for how we will leverage federal and other investments and what type of economic development projects are a priority for our region. All EDA applications require that your project is in alignment with the comprehensive economic development strategy for the district. So if you have a question about how your project aligns with the goals and strategies contained in the comprehensive economic development strategy, please contact me and we can go over the alignments between your project and our comprehensive economic development strategy. Another resource that I want you to take advantage of is this eda.gov/coronavirus. This page has everything you need to prepare for your application. I would recommend you take a look over this before you give me a call. It's kind of like, I don't want to be the IT guy who's telling you to restart your computer. So this has a lot of the key information that you're going to need for a successful application, including the FAQ, which kind of goes over commonly asked questions, and the notice of funding availability. If you'll see that right at the top, where there is the yellowish box, that is where you click to find the official grant information. And Jason did mention also on the EDA page is the investment priorities. If your project doesn't align with any of these investment priorities, it probably will not be a competitive project. And you probably can give me a call and see what would a competitive project be, and we can work out what that would look like. So the first thing you're going to need to do when submitting your application is register at grants.gov and get all of your federal grant submission information in line. So this is going to create a profile, and you're going to have to log in. And up in the upper right-hand corner, it says you see search grant opportunities. The grant opportunity number for this grant is 11307. So you're going to enter that. You're going to create your login for the system, and you're going to register for grants.gov, or someone in your organization, your government, your economic development organization is going to create an account if one does not already exist. Once you're in and you search that 11301, you're going to come up with these 3 pop-ups that are going to pop up. And you're going to apply for the opportunity number, the PWEAA 2020. That's the actual opportunity you're going to be applying for under the CARES Act. So make sure that this is the opportunity that pulls up, and then you're going to click that big apply button up on the right-hand side. And when you do that, this is going to come up with, the related documents. There's another link to the NOFO, and the NOFO really explains everything about the application in depth. I can recommend that you start reading on page 46 for the specific CARES Act information. So when you find this, you've got this, you're going to name your application and create a workspace in grants.gov. And you're again going to select the top one, the EDA construction full application. If it's a construction project, contact me if you're doing a non-construction project, and I can talk to you about through what the difference is between a construction and non-construction application is like. So once you're there, this is all of the documents that you are going to need to complete an EDA application. It might be a little intimidating from this view, but it is completely manageable, and we can get you in a strong application just with these documents. So going over it, these are all the documents listed, and I'm going to kind of escape and kind of go through those documents and what the EDA is looking for in those documents and how to fill out this application. Again, you don't have to remember all this. I will help you fill out an application once we've kind of discussed the scope and help you work through all these documents to make sure you have a complete application. So I'm going to escape out of this, and I'm going to open up some of our forms. So here is the SF 424. I liken it to signing your name onto your SAT. You get 200 points. This is giving the EDA basic information about your project, where it is, who the organization is, who are the responsible parties, what type of applicant it is, just very basic project information, what kind of federal grant it is, a little description of the project, and then all you're going to have is your estimated breakdown. Again, you should be applying, if you're applying under the CARES Act, you should be applying with your federal funding being 80% and your local funding being 20%. Make sure that your congressional districts are properly filled out and attached to question 16. And you want to keep your project dates for construction projects should be 3 years. This is not under 19. This application is not under review of Executive Order 12372 process. So you can click no on that button. And then you're going to have your authorized representative click I agree on this document before submitting. The majority of the application comes in under the ED 900 General Application for EDA Programs. And this is where you're going to have your lead and co-applicants. Your lead applicant needs to be or should be the owner of the infrastructure or construction project. So for example, if Waller County is building a road, they would be the lead applicant. because if they're going to own and maintain it as a county road. If TxDOT is going to be building a road, they will be the lead applicant in the project, and then Waller could be a co-applicant. Your geographic region, how I like to define that is where are you going to be drawing and creating jobs in? What is the job shed for the project? What jobs are going to be created by the project? The two biggest pieces of advice that I can give you for a successful EDA project is how many jobs are you going to be creating or preserving with this project, and how much private investment are you going to be leveraging? So this talks about where are you going to be drawing where is the community that will be impacted by this project? And then question 2 is just a brief description of what you are going to do with the EDA's money. And you're going to describe the project. We just went over the comprehensive economic development strategy. Yes, you do have a comprehensive economic development strategy for your region, and it's the Gulf Coast Economic Development District. Again, if you have any questions about that, please contact me. Describe the economic conditions for your region. You are going to be, if you're applying under the CARES Act, you are going to be discussing how your economy was impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and how this project is going to respond to that to make you more resilient, to help you retain employment, whatever the case may be. That's in B3 where you're going to describe it. You're going to talk about your organization, any partners you have, and then in B6, I went over, and Jason both went over those investment priorities. Tell the EDA how your project aligns with those investment priorities, and then B7, how long it's going to take you to complete this project. B8 is very important. Tell the EDA how many jobs you are going to create or retain with this project. And be honest, work with employers, develop a good methodology that really gets to every job, permanent job that you are going to be creating. All right, look, in B8, they're going to ask you how many jobs created, retained, and what is your private investment? And then they're going to ask you, how did you come up with this in B8C? The beneficiaries of the project. A lot of EDA projects are, for example, providing infrastructure to an industrial park or facility. And who is that employer, and what is their NAICS code? Tell them, the EDA, about this employer in this B9. The EDA is going to need to know that your match is ready and unencumbered. Even if you're doing an in-kind match, and we can go over what is an acceptable in-kind match, the EDA needs to know that there is no other pending status to that match funding, and that it's available as needed for the project to go forth. And then you're going to have some real justification for sole source procurement. I do not recommend it. Under B12, unless you have an immovable piece of equipment that is, perhaps for a workforce development project, I would not recommend coming to the EDA for your equipment needs. The EDA is best at funding infrastructure. And then here is the regional, here's your eligibility. Again, you're going to go back and define the project, and your eligibility, again, is under here: economic distresses, special need, C2C, natural or other major disasters or emergencies. That's what you're going to be. This is for the coronavirus pandemic. The substantial direct benefit is not something you need to be worried about, but you need to provide direct benefit to the area that you're going to be serving. So usually you have to provide unemployment data, but since the entire nation is a declared disaster, you won't be needing to provide this this justification. Budget, you're going to need to describe why you are doing what you are doing with your budget, and that will be in the next form. But this is the narrative portion that you need to explain why your numbers are such. You can't violate anyone's civil rights, and you will not need to be compliant with Executive Order 12372. And then that's you're going to need an audit, but that's pretty much the application. You're going to need to make certain certifications, and at the back there is instructions asking and telling you exactly what to fill out in each portion of the application. There's also instructions in grants.gov that you can download for every portion of the application. For construction projects, there is additional requirements that you have to submit. I would say the key part of this application is the preliminary engineering report. The EDA will not pay for any of your preliminary engineering or any expense occurred before the grant is awarded. So make sure that your preliminary engineering can really describe the project and what the EDA's investment will be. And so this is an overall requirements for the project. You need to own the land or the facility, or someone needs to have current title to the property if you're going to own and maintain the infrastructure. And again, the lead applicant needs to own and maintain the infrastructure. So there's where you're going to describe your permits and what other needs you have, and just more about the project and making sure that the EDA can understand the project through this. But it's a really simple application, and not too restrictive for the federal government. There are going to be certain federal regulations that you have to comply with, but that's pretty much the entire application I've walked through. The additional piece is that you are going to need a project budget, and this is the entire form right here. Again, I want to make sure that you're not putting in too much equipment, and you can clearly demonstrate what your miscellaneous is, and I wouldn't recommend putting anything there. Relocation expenses and payments. That's another thing I want to bring up. The EDA will not pay for you to help relocate an employer from one part of the country to your municipality or jurisdiction. That's just something that the EDA will not fund. And the last page you really need to do is send in a certification saying that you're not going to take the EDA's funds and share them with your political representative. So that is the EDA's application in a nutshell. Again, here are all the forms that you can see, and you can download instructions in the upper right-hand side. Please don't hesitate to contact me. You can find our webpage at www.gcedd.org. And this is what it looks like, and you can see my contact in the lower right-hand side. And this is my contact, and I'm going to leave that up here as we move into the questions portions.
Thank you, Josh, for telling us more about how to fill out that application once we all get the information ready that we want to apply. And that does bring us to the questions portion of the meeting. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box on your control panel for GoToWebinar. And I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Jones with H-GAC to let us know if we have any questions yet.
Thank you, Andrea. We do not have any questions at the moment. If anyone does have one, please look at your question box and type it in there, and we will present them to the presenters to see if they can answer.
I'm going to go ahead and just pop off about kind of the ideal EDA project is infrastructure, bringing or preserving jobs in a community, that being wastewater, that being water, that being roads. What infrastructure does your community need to economically recover from the coronavirus pandemic and support employers through public infrastructure? And that's really the question that you have to ask your community or of your community is, what is the best fit? What is the best fit for creating and preserving employment? And what's going to create jobs? The question we got is, how many projects can we apply for? What the EDA tells communities is bring them your best project. That's really what they're looking for. And the project scope, it should be between $1 and $3 million is a general rule of thumb if it's a construction project. And it should be your best single project within that budget with your map. Jason?
Yes, that's to pick up, to add on to that, oftentimes an applicant will have many proposed projects. And really, I think the guidance we go back to is about supporting the locally driven solution. We would ask the applicant to think about which of these projects is most in need and what would have the biggest impact. You can certainly submit multiple applications, but I would make your best submission first, and you could take secondary applications later as they come. But I would make the best first impression. And I'll just add on to Josh's comment about infrastructure. That is the critical aspect of a lot of what EDA can do, but really uniquely in this case, healthcare systems at large. That can be workforce supporting nursing, allied health, other aspects that might involve beneficiaries, including hospitals or telemedicine as relevant. It's kind of a new space for everyone in many ways. And so we're doing our best to keep an open and creative mind about what is related to healthcare systems, but also economic in nature. So if we can somehow combine two elements there, then I think that is the key outcome of proposed projects under CARES Act.
Josh, I have several questions for you. One is, when is the best time to contact you? This is from Councilmember William King from the city of Dickinson, and he'd like to know if you would be willing to meet him in Dickinson. Josh, you're muted.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
Yes, Councilman King, why don't we go ahead and I got your contact information and I will send you an email right after this. We'll talk about doing an offsite meeting with H-GAC and we'll work through and determine what your best project is.
Okay.
So email is the best way to contact me.
I'm sorry, Josh. From Kimberly Dowdy, she says, thank you so much, H-GAC team and EDA. This was a well-developed, well-organized webinar. Kudos. We were asked if the PowerPoint presentations will be emailed, and they will be available online. I believe we're going to put them on the GCEDD website. And then another question is, what if my project changes after I receive an award? Can I change the project?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I guess what we would want to do is talk about the pre-application process and being collaborative. I'll begin obviously with the first step. If you have an idea for a project and you have a brief summary of that, you could email Josh and myself, and we could start working together to identify what that proposed project is. But we would want to spend as much time as possible ahead of submitting the application, and certainly before being selected for funding, to assure that we have a project that is feasible, has a high likelihood of being completed as expected, and will be successful in the nature it's described. It would not be unusual in past funding opportunities to request a no-cost time extension. That's an amendment that has been common, but that is not the guidance we're receiving for this particular funding opportunity. My understanding is that it's going to be very rigid in that regard. And so to that end, you have about 3 years or less to complete a non-construction project, 5 years or less to complete a construction project. There are cases when the actual scope of work components are adjusted mid-project, but it's few and far between, and we do everything we can to avoid that. But if that is the case, you would reach out to your project officer at that point and address whatever issues need to be addressed.
Okay, I have another question. It says, typically there is a focus on preservation of private sector jobs. Would it be helpful to enumerate the creation, preservation of public sector jobs through the development of infrastructure to increase resiliency?
I can speak to that. So I would say that, you want to focus on the primary private sector jobs. We would count a retained job as critical as creating a new one. Oftentimes, let's say a infrastructure is in disrepair, or perhaps a road is an example. That may leave existing major employers at risk of relocating to find an infrastructure that would support their ongoing operations. So a proposed EDA project might not only improve, but expand its capacity. So for example, that would be a blended impact. You could retain X number of jobs, but also based on the project and the expected private investment, expand hiring So you could retain some portion of jobs, create another portion, and count those up. Again, focusing on the high-skilled manufacturing, advanced trades, certified skilled trade sectors, usually retail, service industry, things like that are typically not the most competitive. They may often come along and also benefit from a proposed EDA project, but in and of themselves, oftentimes are not quite enough to justify an EDA investment. To the extent that there are public sector jobs involved, that can certainly be communicated and would be helpful information to have. But again, the primary focus being on creating jobs in the private sector.
I think Jason had a really good point about the EDA really wanting to fund those primary jobs, because those primary jobs are what create induced employment. You can't have retail without primary jobs. And so that's what the EDA is really focused on building. And that's really the jobs that count most in your application. And healthcare is a new sector, because that's typically more of a viewed as more of a service rather than a primary. But we're looking for, even within that, the healthcare projects that are creating something that is exportable is even more beneficial than serving your population jobs.
Jason or Josh, I've been asked, is broadband eligible?
Absolutely. Broadband is included under the infrastructure category, and it's a great investment for communities to be owning conduit for future broadband expansion. And so that is something that we absolutely recommend if you're doing a typical EDA project, to consider including broadband conduit as part of the scope. If you're laying a water or sewer line out to a major employer, it might be worthwhile to lay that conduit as well. Or you could come to the EDA and develop a good scope for how that could work to develop broadband infrastructure to a needed employer.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Another one is, what is the ceiling grant amount for a construction infrastructure project?
Yeah, that's a common question and not easy to answer. Again, we are charged with dispersing our grant awards geographically throughout our 5-state region to, and in this case, we have every county and parish eligible. And so with that in mind, the $236 million appropriated for Austin is a significant and tremendous amount of funding, but when spread throughout the 5-state region, it is resulting in some cases a more modest amount per project than you might have seen, for example, in your region for Hurricane Harvey recovery. To answer your question in general, I think going forward, I would recommend developing the most genuine, impactful scope of work that is relevant to the community's ability to retain and create jobs. And we're expecting an approximate $3 million average project cost when we look back at this 2-year cycle. Well, there'll be some certainly much less, perhaps even some more, but in average, that will be the average amount that we expect to see. I guess I'll speak a little bit to what I would call carving out a scope of work or schedule of work. Oftentimes from a local perspective, you may have a project that is perhaps $5 or $10 million or more, and there might be a critical schedule of work or phase, if you will, that when it's completed can result in economic productivity or activity of some sort, some value when that phase is completed. So there are times when you may have a larger scale of a project that you want to talk with Josh and myself about carving out a smaller schedule that maybe is aligned with, earlier Josh had mentioned perhaps a range of $1 to $3 million for planning and technical assistance grants. I've seen those awarded oftentimes in $200,000 to $300,000 to $400,000 and up. But at any rate, we can work together to find out what is an appropriate schedule of work. And bear in mind, one last thought on that is that the proposed scope of work and its schedule, nothing could be reimbursed or counted as a part of the EDA project until the grant award is announced. And so pre-award activities, grant application activities, sometimes design and planning will need to be done. Appraisals on property or buildings would need to be done prior to being selected. Those would not be eligible to be reimbursed. So thinking positively, when you receive a grant award, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 months from now, depending on when you submit your application, that date of the press release is the date the proposed EDA project can begin.
That's a very good point, Jason. And one thing I'd build on is in carving out a scope. For example, if you're a community that is looking to build out, fiber broadband, you want to do that all over your community. Possibly it would make sense to carve out the EDA, the fiber broadband that is going to your major employers, that is going to your hospitals, and use that part as of the overall project as a narrow scope that you would apply under the EDA grant, and then fund the rest of your project through other avenues. But really getting the scope down of your project to make sure that it aligns with the notice of funding opportunity. And again, I'm always happy to talk about that.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, gentlemen, that I'd like to get in before we need to close this webinar. One of them is, what is an example of something that is exportable?
Josh, what, from your regional perspective, what?
Any good or service that you can trade outside of the region. So for example, if you are, a petrochemical manufacturer or any sort of small manufacturer, that is something that is tradable and exportable out of the region and brings money into the region. So it's not necessarily, a service sector, but it can be a service. If, for example, you have intellectual property that you are developing.
Okay, and the last one that I see is, if I am partnering with an industrial developer that is bringing 200 to 1,000 jobs that will need infrastructure, be a good project. Not certain how to tie in medical, although due to the high volume of jobs that will be needed. 2 of them will be in a distressed new market tax credit area.
That sounds like a great start to a project. So send me an email and let's talk through it.
And just quickly adding to that, remember, we still have and always will have on a rolling basis our regular EDA programs. The fundamentals, a lot of what we spoke about today remain intact in terms of job creation and primary jobs. But if that nexus isn't quite there for CARES Act, we do have our regular public works and economic adjustment assistance programs, for example. So if you have an idea along the lines of what you just described, let's just start talking about the project, and maybe it fits in a regular program or maybe it's CARES Act, but either way, there could be a good next step there.
And just one more comment is that enhancing economic resilience, bringing jobs that are in a new industry or from a new major employer, that can be responsive to the NOFO because of the unemployment that has been created by the coronavirus pandemic. So if that's y'all's situation, that can fit with it under that rubric.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I don't see any other questions here. Andrea, if you'd like to close the webinar.
All right, thank you. Today we learned a lot about ways to work with the EDA, how to complete a competitive application, and how to access the available tools and resources. I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you to H-GAC staff for keeping this webinar running smoothly today, and to our Executive Director, Chuck Wimple, for getting this webinar going. And I want to particularly thank you, our presenters, Jeffrey Shostrom, Jason Wilson, and Josh Owens. As a reminder, all the presentations will be available online, and we'll send you a follow-up email to let you know what the link for that is. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
I look forward to hearing from all y'all. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.